Chair, we are live streaming and we are recording the meeting and we are good to go.
Hey, thank you. Well, welcome everybody to the PCAC meeting of July 28th. I'm just going to go through the roll here. We have Councilmember Miles. She was going to join remotely, but I guess she's not here quite yet. We have Board Member Garvey, and she is joining remotely tonight. Supervisor Alcorn is here in person. Supervisor Glass is here in person, and Supervisor Franklin is here in person. We have Vice Mayor Elizabeth Parker is here, and Councilmember Duncan is here. We have Councilmember John Seeley is here remotely, and Vice Mayor Svesky is here, and Vice Mayor Banks is joined us remotely. Councilmember Alam is not here tonight, but we have our Mayor Sheila Olam is here from Herndon, so that's nice. She's gonna take her place tonight. Vice Mayor Martinez is not here, and Councilmember Milan. Okay, that is that. So, and also thank you, well, Chair Miles filled in for me since she's not here, but she filled in for me on April 28th, and that's the next order of business. We do need to pass the meeting minutes. So if everyone read those, I was not here, but we have the summary notes of April 28th, 2021 to pass. If someone would like to make a motion.
I move approval.
Okay, is there a second? Okay, all in favor, Guy? I'd like to abstain if I wasn't here.
Aye.
Okay, great. All right, that passes. Okay, and tonight we have transaction goals and objectives, and Mr. Jasper, Principal Transportation Planning and Programming, is here to give us a presentation on that.
Thank you very much. Good evening, committee members, Madam Chair. I'll be brief. Since Mr. 11 here, who is Deputy Project Manager for Cambridge Systematics, our consultant for developing the next update to transaction, our long-range plan, and 3 iterations, 3 updates of our 6-year program as well during the life of that contract. She's going to be doing most of the talking, I'm pleased to say. I just wanted to go through a few introductory points. In your packet, we have the presentation. Haroon, if you could just advance the slides. So on page 2, you'll see an agenda of what we're going to cover tonight. It's mostly actually going to be the goals, objectives, performance measures, and core values. And then we want to just touch on scenario analysis and be very brief with some next steps. Before we do any of that, if you go to the next slide, please, Haroon, just talk in terms of the general approach. This is the general approach to the work that Cambridge Systematics has been hired to do for us. Transaction, you'll see in a little wheel to the right. I hope those who are online can see this from the meeting packages. That kind of wheel has got 3 phases associated with transaction updates. We're currently in phase 1, and that's really mostly what we're going to talk about this evening. So during that phase 1, objectives, measures, and weights we'll be talking about this evening. We are developing project lists to include in transaction. The current version of transaction, which was adopted in October of 2017, has 352 projects in it. I don't know what the final number is. Too early to say what the final number will be for the current update transaction, but it's likely to be a similar number. We refer to bottom-up and top-down projects. This is really just insider speak. It's not something to particularly worry about, but it just references how we get to the projects that are in transaction. So the bottom-up projects generally come from your comprehensive plans or other planning documents and transit system development plans and the like. It's not to say that every project that's in a comp plan is in transaction, because transaction is regional, whereas your comp plans I'll also have the local element to that as well. The most regional looking projects from the comprehensive plans and other plans represent the bottom-up projects. They've already been through some public process. The top-down projects generally are projects that come in later in the process and represent projects that would not necessarily appear in a comprehensive plan. So oftentimes technology projects, things that span the entire region or large parts of the region, including beyond the region, might be examples of top-down projects, but they generally get added later when we've had a chance to look at the analytics to see how well the bottom-up projects are performing, and we will look to kind of fill some gaps in the project list to help address any unmet needs that we can identify. So next bullet there, needs assessment is a key part of that process. The scenarios, we'll be defining the scenarios during phase one. We won't actually be doing the analysis until phase two. And these scenarios, there will likely be 4 that we'll select, are really intended to help us do some sensitivity testing to see what if the future in 2045 doesn't actually turn out to be the way that the region's cooperative forecast suggests it might be. So, and things happen that are external to NVDA controls, what might that impact be? So I think we'll be talking about scenarios in just a moment. And then a large part of what we do in phase one is building a transportation model and networks for analysis. So this is not starting from scratch, it's all based off the region's transportation model, but we need to do some tailoring for Northern Virginia. So it's based off the same travel demand, but it's kind of more granular in nature. It's much more detailed. In the middle of the circle, in orange, you see public and stakeholder engagement, which kind of is in the middle because it indicates it's something that's kind of continuous throughout the entire process. But it changes from phase to phase, and it changes between transaction and 6-year program. So right now, in phase one, we're actually already commenced this public engagement work through focus groups. We had 4 focus groups last week. We have 4 this week, starting with 2 this evening. If focus groups are generally invitation only, whether it's us or anyone else doing them, you invite a particular audience that is representative of the larger audience that you're trying to learn from. So that work is underway now. The larger piece of public engagement is about the launch. This is going to be an online survey, which will launch Friday of next week. That's the current plan. It may slip by a day or 2 at the most. We will send you a link to this survey when it goes active. We'll give you a heads up tonight that that's coming. Obviously, the quality of the survey is going to depend upon the number of people who respond and how representative they are of the region. Certainly in terms of the former and possibly the latter, we would like to enlist your help with your newsletters or whatever else you put out to your constituents. If you could reshare that with folks, that would greatly help us get a representative view from the entire region. We greatly appreciate it. Any help you can give us. We'll be doing the best we can on our side, but every leveraging opportunity we can take, we'd like to take. So that's something to expect to see within a week, I would say.
How long will the survey be active?
We are planning to keep the survey up until around the middle of September. So 5 or 6 weeks. So that's underway, and also what we'll be doing in kind of in parts. There's another group of individuals beyond the online survey, which is addressing or really pointing towards citizens. We have our stakeholder groups as well. So stakeholder groups in this case will be organizations that interact with us, who have membership. So we'll be we'll be reaching out to them to get them also to forward the survey to their members, but we also do plan, but probably not until after the survey is closed. We do plan to meet with representatives of the stakeholders, a stakeholder group, so we can have a discussion with them kind of at a kind of a more organizational level. We haven't defined dates or formats for that yet, whether it'll be in person or online. It's too soon to say, but that will probably be, at some point in either late September or early October doing that. And that ties in very much with the overall schedule for phase one. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Lorraine. In fact, go to the next one after that, because I want to move on to objectives now. Just a few reminders really at this stage, definitions and guidelines. You have actually seen this before, or some of you have in previous meetings, just to kind of set the stage for what we're about to talk about. So ultimately, we need to get to performance measures and weights to help us with the analytical process. That all started with the vision, which this committee helped us to craft and recommends, and the authority took action on this in December of last year. We'll come back to what the vision actually says in just a moment. It does incorporate the core values, which you see in the blue call-out box. Well, actually mentioned in the blue call-out box to the right. We actually have 3 core values, and these are overarching principles that don't just influence the content of the plan, they influence the overall planning process as well. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. So the vision is set. The goals, objectives will kind of become more defined and more tangible steps towards getting to the measures. And this evening we want to focus on the objectives. We'll touch on goals, but the goals themselves kind of at that kind of similar aspirational level to the vision, and so they're really crafted from the vision. The objectives begin to work down more towards priorities of the region. So that's where we want to focus the discussion. Next slide, please. Just for reference, we're not going to dwell on this, but the current transaction, the one that was adopted in October of 2017, the vision statement is shown on the left, and in the multicolored table with very small fonts, you can see perhaps the first column shows the 3 goals associated with the current transaction. There are 9 objectives associated with those 3 goals, and then there are 15 measures associated with those 9 objectives. And in the last column, there are the weights that are associated with each measure. And because of the number of the measures, it was not really possible to have weights that were larger than 10%. So we ended up with a mix of 5s and 10s. I think there are 10 measures with a 5% weight, 5 measures with a 10% weight, all of which means that there's 15 priorities and they're all pretty much the same level of priority. That's like 2 tiers of priority, but they're all kind of very close. And so in the long run, from a planning point of view, we kind of look upon 15 measures as being really too many measures. We kind of settled on that last time because that's kind of the point of compromise, I guess. But we're trying to get towards halving that list of measures this go around, so we can differentiate more between them and set different weights that kind of more accurately reflect priorities. And the survey, the focus groups, the discussion with the stakeholders, as well as meetings with the committees such as yours, will all help steer us towards each kind of group's feeling about what the priorities for the region should be, and that will work its way through MBTA's evaluation process and eventually reach funding decisions. So while the plan itself is looking out to 2045, that kind of seems a long way in the future, and by the time in 2045, and it doesn't really matter to me. Well, it does matter because as soon as this plan update is adopted, for which we're targeting November 2022, next year, the very first 6-year program and 2 subsequent ones after that will be using in part the evaluations that are done in transactions. So we cannot fund projects that are not in transactions. So when this new plan is adopted, the projects that are in it are the only ones we can fund. We won't be able to fund all of them, guarantee that, but I can guarantee if they're not in that update, they will not be able to be funded by MBTA using MBTA's regional revenues. They can still be funded by other means, obviously, but not by us. So that's that. If we could just move on to the next slide. I just want to just talk you through just in terms of scheduling, just very briefly. June behind us now, I know, but that was where we were kind of working through the planning work for our public engagement efforts. In this month, we're meeting with statutory committees such as this one. We met with the technical advisory group last week. We met with the planning and programming committee the week before that. So in this phase, this is the final meeting to have this conversation, and this conversation is intended to introduce you to what we've got to take action on, but there's no action that we're going to take on this tonight. So this is informational, opportunity to ask questions. We'll revisit this with a bit more information in September, and then by which time the summer public engagement will be mostly over, and then we're looking for this committee and others in October to recommend measures for the authority to take action on in November, and then a month later we'll come back and talk about the weights associated with the measures, once we know the measures have actually been confirmed. So that's the kind of the near-term look over the next 6 months or so for what we're going to be doing. And then when that's done, we'll be moving into phase 2. We'll start on how it will work. That's it. So I'm going to hand over to Dahlia now to talk through the new vision statement and how we're looking to use that, what are the goals and objectives that we want to talk about tonight. But before I go, if there's any questions for me, I'll be happy to take them, and Dahlia, I'd be happy for you to interrupt her at any point in the conversation.
I have a quick question for the stakeholder groups. Who will be included in those discussions?
Well, what we're doing right now is kind of building out the stakeholder group list. So we want to include and approach anyone who has engaged with us in the past. Sure, that's going to be relatively easy for us because we already have those contacts. But there are other groups that I'm sure MBTA has never engaged with, and given one of the 3 core values is equity, the sorts of groups that are dealing with underserved populations are people we'd love to reach and talk to, because the feedback we constantly get about what is equity and what can you do to help an underserved population is, well, why don't you ask them? So we need to find the right. We want to reach the citizens individually if we can, and we mentioned this, but as part of the survey work, we're going to be doing some pop-up events, which are going to be targeted pop-up events, so that where we see gaps in the coverage that we're getting for the online survey, we want to try and fill those gaps as we go forward. But we are anticipating, and we want to avoid any gaps from underserved populations in particular. So anything we can do to get to underserved populations will be great. So that I mean, it's any group that has an interest in transportation in Northern Virginia will be, hopefully on that list. And so we'll find, 1 or 2 points of contact within those organizations. We'll reach out to them over the summer and say, hey, this survey, please direct members towards this, but also, in the fall, please look out for more information to have a chat, we're in this room or online or something like that.
Anyone else?
All right, so Keith has just showed me up by proving he can stand and talk at the same time. And after 1.5 years of doing online meetings, I'm convinced I can actually do that. So I'm going to stay here unless anybody else is opposed, so that we can have a bit of a conversation about what's in this slide. So Varun, you want to flip us over? We'll do this one very quickly because you all have seen the vision statement before. This is not new. So thinking about, we have this new vision statement for transaction. And so what we're doing with that at the moment, right, is thinking about it from a couple of perspectives. One of them is how do we develop goals and thereby all of the objectives and other stuff that we're going to get more in detail on. But also, this vision statement outlines our 3 core values. And those are safety, equity, and sustainability, which we will all be humming in our sleep by the time this project is over. But on the next slide, sorry, everyone. We've got some discussion of what those core values are, right? So while we've got some idea of how we want to define these things, we're also working with the focus groups that Keith mentioned this week. They're probably talking about these 3 core values right now. And we'd also sort of love if you would take a look at these and think about how would you think about some of these core values. So from the perspective of equity, are we talking about ensuring the fairness of accessibility to different groups of people? Are we talking about equity from a geographic perspective, making sure that the more urban areas in Northern Virginia have the same opportunities, the same access as some of the more suburban or more rural ones? We want to think about sustainability, and the definition that's actually quite widely used for sustainability is focus on meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, which does, say sustainability tends to have an environmental bring to it, and that is one part of it. But we also want to think about it from an economic perspective, social perspective. So there's multiple lenses that you can look at that core value with. And then, of course, safety, which is something we want to make sure is incorporated into any project but we want to make sure that that's also a part of the overall process as a whole.
The thing that jumped out at me on the safety was when it says fatalities and severe injuries, but what is the definition of severe injuries?
Okay.
And does it have to be severe? I mean, if a neighbor got hit in a crosswalk, she's on a walker already.
I'm sorry for your name.
Yeah, she's doing fine now, but that injury shouldn't have happened. Fortunately, it didn't make her worse off than she already was, but would that be severe?
I mean, it depends. There are technical definitions
Yes.
at the federal level of what qualifies as severe, but perhaps we're thinking that we'd be more comfortable with a version that just address injuries as a whole.
Because if we are trying to get people to walk, don't we want people to feel like they can walk without being run down? Seems to be an issue. Thank you.
No one's opposed to ending non-severe injuries as well, so that's good. Other thoughts on this? We can keep going and we can come back to them. So thinking about these core values, we can go ahead. I'm sorry, I told everyone to watch for when I turn the page, and then I lied because I brought a version that has 2 slides. Sorry. What we're looking at here is, as Keith mentioned, we want to make sure that these core values are incorporated into the entire transaction process and the product that comes out of it, so that we can holistically address each of those core values. And this table here is really showing a start at how we think we might be able to incorporate these core values into different parts of the process so far. I fully expect that by the time we get to the end of this project, this will be a much longer table with many more columns of different places we were able to incorporate and leverage these core values. But certainly, already in the early stages, as we mentioned, talking about identifying needs and developing projects based on these core values. We're going to want to talk about how we can incorporate that into the objectives and the performance metrics. There might be a role for these in helping to develop policies for the region or other work that MVP might do. And we'll get into some of the scenario analysis discussion as well and how we might use those. So this is just a start and some initial thinking, but we have
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. On this one, the fact that safety and equity were left out of the scenario analysis was concerning.
So it does look concerning, actually. And I will say, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but so any scenario that we come up with would be evaluated based on the performance metrics and the objectives that we're talking about here. So they would be evaluated through the lens of those performance metrics, so they would be incorporated there. It may be, say, harder to come up with a scenario that's based solely on. This is the third time I've done this presentation, and I'm learning that this is not the best graphic for conveying that little bit of information. So we will work on that one. But that was the intention. Okay, there.
My exact question.
Okay, everybody is in
You were
agreement.
taking a line.
This is not the best graphic. Oh, he's getting up. All right. So our next slide, which Arun will turn to as soon as he gets back to the seat, is we've taken that vision statement and started thinking about what some potential goals are for transactions. And we've gotten to 3 potential goals that we think sort of incorporate the range of what transaction might be trying to achieve. And I will read them quickly, and we can talk about them, or we can come back to them in a little bit. But we're looking at mobility, which we're talking about as enhancing the quality of life by improving the mobility of Northern Virginia on the region's multimodal transportation system. We're thinking about accessibility, so access, strengthening the region's economy by increasing access to jobs, employees, markets, destinations, anything we could make that list go on. And the third one being resiliency. So that's looking at enhancing operational performance of the multimodal transportation system during unusual conditions and its ability to recover from disruption.
Meryl.
On this one, we don't have any mention of the core values, safety, equity, and sustainability. Shouldn't they be part of the heart of the goals?
I mean, it's worth a conversation. One, there are ways that each of these can be worked into, and actually, as we turn the pages, we're going to get to the objectives which come under these goals, and you will see those core values reflected in the objectives. Right now, the goals are a little bit, they're a little bit different, and they're a little bit bigger picture. Because we have to incorporate other things in these goals beyond just 3 core values. But we will get to them and we will show them in the objectives.
And one other thing is, we're a town and there are other towns and smaller folks that want to be part of the process. But we have new metro stations coming along the Dulles Toll Road. And so we have been planning that for years. And I don't see anything about future growth, the land use, and the traffic impact that's going to be coming to these jurisdictions. So it might look like right there in Herndon, we don't need anything, or maybe in Vienna. But reality is we are planning and the density is really going to be coming up. And the town of Herndon will be sandwiched between a metro stop in Loudon and a metro stop right there in Fairfax. So
That is absolutely true. I will say that all of the analysis that we will be doing for this will be looking at 2045 conditions. So we'll account for all of the currently planned growth in Herndon and elsewhere around the region, and that would be the larger region as well. So thinking about what might happen in Maryland, and we'll also account for everything that's already planned and programmed. So including the Silver Line extension, including some other highway projects and other things. All of that will be built into the baseline and anything else that we want to analyze. So we will be able to look at, as Keith mentioned, as part of the needs assessment, not just today's needs, but 2045 needs.
Delia, are we using COG's cooperative forecast? Don't quote me on what round they are, and that's derived from all the planning directors in the region, getting together, talking about population growth, employment growth, and things of that nature.
If you want to be very nerdy about it, like I do, the cooperative runs 9.2 forecasts from accountable governments and
So now one area, and it's not in the town of Herndon, but it will greatly affect us, will be, will we have that bridge going over the toll road that straddles Loudon and Fairfax County?
Absolutely.
Oh, yes, yes.
So, thank you for asking a bunch of questions. Last meeting was all me. Back to the question of what's a core value versus a goal. I'm curious, like why safety isn't a goal. Why is it a goal or a core value? And then you could probably say for any of these.
So there's a couple of different reasons we're framing it that way. One of them is, I think probably everyone in this room and everyone on any of our committees agree that we shouldn't be building anything if it's not safe automatically. So it's almost like it's a principle that everything else should be built on, not that we should be necessarily planning to optimize it. It's that it's a given, hopefully, in what we're building and designing. The second piece of it is that, unfortunately, safety is notoriously hard to forecast out to 2045. And so we do have it as an objective, but we wanted to sort of have a few small number of goals and work our way out, sort of like the table with the teeny tiny print that Pete was showing earlier. So we do have it as an objective, but we did not include it as a goal because it is so fundamental for thinking to the design and construction.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. I might suggest safety. I know it's hard to measure, but frankly, fatalities. There are things that we are measuring now very much.
Yes,
And-
measuring it current is very straightforward.
Yes.
Predicting how, say, adding a bridge across the toll road is going to impact safety in the future can be harder.
Yes, but that is one of the big changes that we're undergoing as a region. Frankly, moving away from shoving cars through at high speeds to the types of development. It is, I don't know, we might want to be open to moving that into a goal.
Okay.
Only because this is such a major change that we're looking at.
And would you say enhanced quality of life, how would that be measured? All of us have different ideas of how quality of life would be measured. I'm assuming you mean not sitting in a car for 2 hours getting to work, but I don't know if that's correct.
We have a couple of ways that we're talking about, and I actually suggest we flip the page.
Okay.
We can talk about
Sorry,
those in
we're
great detail.
getting ahead of
Do not
ourselves.
apologize. That is the whole point. I love when people do my segues for me. So the next three pages that you'll find in your packet and that will show up here are some of the objectives that we're thinking belong under each of these goals to give you a little bit more idea of what we're thinking about here. And again, some of the sample measures, these are just, some of them are things that were in that table with the teeny tiny print from last time. Some of them are things that we're just sort of toying around with that we've heard from other folks on this. So none of those performance metrics are set in stone, but we wanted to illustrate that they could be done for illustration purposes. But primarily, we're hoping to focus on the goals which we've started to discuss in the objectives. So looking under mobility, where we do have that quality of life mentioned in the goal itself, we have 3 potential objectives that we're talking about right now. So one of them is reducing congestion and delays, which, as you say, people not sitting in their car for 2 hours a day or more. So thinking that's one of the, the key things the transaction is designed to combat, right? Is that congestion. So we definitely have that there as an objective. There are numerous ways that can be, quantified and measured by way of performance metrics. And that is something that is required by the HB 599 legislation, but was also done last time for similar reasons. I'm going to do the other two, and then we can come around to questions. The second one is improving travel time reliability. So that's can people make the same trip reliably? That can be both in cars, that can be on transit as well. On multiple modes is thinking about not only do we have congestion, do we have recurring congestion, or do we have incidental congestion? So that's something that can tie back to safety, right? Crashes are something that tend to cause huge unreliability in trips. So that's something that can incorporate some of that safety core value. And then our third one is looking at reducing transportation-related emissions as a quality of life issue, but that obviously also ties back to safety if we want to broaden that to think about public health, but it also has sustainability connotations, and there are definitely potential equity connotations to emissions as well. Thoughts on these?
With these, they all seem to be very car-centric, and if this is how it's being measured, we aren't showing anything for non-motorized, such as cyclists and pedestrians.
Mm-hmm.
Encouraging
We
those.
do have some. Any projects that we would think of that say might encourage more people to bike, to walk, to take transit, any of those things would have impacts on all three of these, right? If we're pulling people off of the roads, they would have impacts on congestion, they would have impacts on reliability, they would have impacts on emissions. So that's one way that gets accounted for. There are other ways that we can think about in other objectives, but we can think about how for some measures we can make sure that we're capturing that for all the different types of projects.
But that's this multimodal, I think it really does need to.
Right, because that's what we have really been planning and working hard and putting money and staff time and trying to make sure that people aren't going to try to drive to that metro stop and turn to when you can get on a circular bus, drive or walk. I mean, ride your bike or walk. If we don't have any public parking on our side, so we want to make sure you're not in a car.
Yeah, just to follow up, completely agree. I was going to raise that. I think one of the things we don't, we have our LOS measurements. We don't have a good measurement for pedestrians, bicyclists, and vehicles that actually can be a single measure. We just don't. And so it makes it very, very difficult to plan out mobility in these transit-oriented communities. So I would love to see an objective that is explicit in maximizing or increasing pedestrian, bicycle mobility, something like that. And maybe it doesn't belong as a potential objective, but something that makes it clear we need better measurements of overall mobility that can be applied to specific projects. It could basically do the analysis for the types of developments that the mayor's talking about. We just don't have it.
And Ms. Hoffman, want to say
Well,
something?
and thank you, Madam Chair. And what I would note is something we discuss internally all the time, because usually the added capacity, they have pedestrian element to that. But the primary project, if you will, is a road project. But you are also capturing some bike and pedestrian elements. When we have something like the W and O trail, and we separated facilities, that's a little different. But we're trying to, you know, capture those elements. And that's one thing we always try to note with the road projects, not trying to give them prevalence, but there are some bike and pedestrian components. Now, how we capture that for the modeling purposes and under the mobility objectives, we can do a little more work on.
And I recall last time we went through this, the measures and the weights, I think we added, there was some of that in there. And that's kind of where it gets to start adding weights to, you know, to check this off, 10% for, you know, walkability and things like that, safety. I know we have them there.
I think you guys might like some of the objectives we have under accessibility. So let's turn the page one more time. So in accessibility, we've got 2 objectives, but possibly more measures that we might want to think about. So the first one is improving access to jobs for residents of Northern Virginia. So this is again one of those things that aligning with the HB 509 requirements, but it's about what economic opportunities, which we're quantifying using jobs in the region, can folks get to within a given amount of time. That can look at all of the modes. That can look at, I think one of the things we may add to this year that we didn't have in the last transaction update might be considering this both from the perspective of, you know, the average resident in the region, but also taking a closer look at for the equity populations. How is their access needs being addressed? Are we providing access to those economic opportunities for those groups? So that's something we've been thinking about, making sure gets included in the measures that might be associated with this objective this time around. The second one, we'll come back, I promise, is we're phrasing it right now as improving multimodal connectivity to improve access while reducing dependence on driving alone. And there's a number of ways, again, that this could be measured. And there are a number of ways that this could either be reworded so that it includes things like optimizing that non-motorized experience for folks, whether that's providing access to transit stations, whether that's providing internal circulation within some of these dense areas, or whether that's, you know, providing these longer distance connections that might be necessary. So there's a lot of ways to think about, but I thought that might be up your guys' path.
Yeah, are you going to have some kind of acknowledgement to, if you are using transit, it might take you 10 or 15 minutes to get to the bus stop. It might take you, because if you're walking or taking your bicycle.
Yes, absolutely. So any of the analysis that we do accounts for a full end-to-end trip. So that would be walking to access the bus, waiting for the bus, depending on how frequent they come, riding the bus, walking to your final destination. So it does include that whole trip.
I know we had a Herndon resident that worked at Dulles Airport. And if you've ever gone to Dulles Airport from Herndon, maybe 10 minutes. It was taking her over 45 minutes to get to work every day because she had to catch a bus and it had to go stop all over the place. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a measure you're going to like on the next page. And there's another.
Yeah, just very quickly, and actually, I think you just kind of answered part of my point, but so I live in Prince William County, which is probably the furthest from a metro stop since we don't have any, but you know, I see the 60 minutes by transit, and I think what is probably more helpful if we are creating solutions that reduce that number. So for instance, I think on the metro from Springfield to like L'Enfant, or really many other parts of the metro stop in DC, should be about 30 minutes in like during rush hour, and probably about 50 minutes, you know, off peak hours. And so 60 minutes is kind of a long time if you're taking the metro, for instance. And so just wondering if we can kind of, or maybe you can explain maybe the 60 minutes by transit, but part of the answer may be what you just said, and that you're considering how long does it take to get to the metro stop or whatever transit facility, how long does it take to get to your end destination? So that may be the answer, but wondering if you can elaborate.
Yeah, because how long does it take to get from Woodbridge to Springfield before
That's
you get on
right,
that?
that's right, absolutely.
Yes, so that is definitely part of the answer. I will say these thresholds can be legitimately set wherever, we decide to set them. These are the thresholds I will say that were used in metrics in the last transaction, so it may be beneficial for continuity's sake to use similar thresholds, but it's by no means written in stone. Generally speaking, as you say, right, it's the whole trip, and we're thinking about how far people can get within what might be considered a reasonable commute time. Now, I know not everybody agrees on what a reasonable commute time is, but these are some thresholds that have been used widely, both in this region and around the country. So that's why we're starting with them on the list. We can play around with those. And the reason right now that it's also common practice to have that transit threshold be a little higher than the drive threshold, generally speaking, because you do have those access pieces, trips will take generally a little longer, but you do want to think about how much longer. Is it unreasonable to ask somebody to spend 45 minutes on a bus when the trip might take 10 minutes to drive? But if it might take 45 minutes to drive, 60 on a bus might not seem so bad, right? So that's why those are a little bit different.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to, again, make sure that the smaller jurisdictions are, like, when you have Loudon on one side of you and Fairfax County on the other side, Ruston Town Center is very busy, and all the new development. We just want to make sure that we get a fair shot at some of the process, because we are taking on a lot by increasing the density to make Metro successful. And so we're just going to need a lot of help.
So let's go to our last set of objectives, which might have a couple of things people might want to see. The first objective that we've got on this page is maintaining operations of the regional transportation system during extreme conditions. This again is required by the HB 599 legislation, which talked, I think, primarily about homeland security events and evacuation, but we can now add tornadoes, earthquakes, freak snowstorms that keep people in their cars for 19 hours, a whole host of other unusual circumstances that we have discovered since that legislation was written that this could be appropriate for. And so generally speaking, throughout the last couple of rounds of transaction, that's been measured by sort of throwing a bunch more traffic at the system and seeing how it reacts to that. It's not a perfect measure, but it's a proxy for something that any number of emergencies that we can't predict and don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about all the things that could go wrong. So that's our first objective. The second one is expanding travel choices to reduce dependence on driving alone. And so we're thinking about this from the perspective of, are we providing, I'll call them redundant options for people to get places? So do you have multiple choices about how you might get to your job at Dallas Airport? And are they good redundant choices? So if your only other option is a bus that takes 4 times as long, that may not be considered a good redundant option, and we would want to reward projects that make that option better for you. So we're still very much toying with metrics that might work and that might be explainable. We've got some great mathematical ideas that it takes me about 3 minutes to explain to anybody. And that's generally speaking not ideal for a performance metric. So we're gonna keep working on that. But again, our objective there is to make sure that those trips have good alternative paths, whether that's biking, whether that's the bus, whether that's transit, whatever that might be. And then the third objective that we've put in here is improving the safety of the transportation system. So this is that objective. Again, we need to think about how that can be applied across all modes, right? So pedestrian, bike, technology projects, which could improve safety, driving, transit, all of those things. We want to make sure that we're capturing that there. And the reason we put it under resiliency, although it could easily go under any of the goals, is just because it does tend to have some of the safety projects can have an impact on, you know, the ability of the system to bounce back, right? If we have fewer accidents, we might have fewer of these extreme conditions, that sort of thing. So those are the three that we're thinking about here. And all together, we think it makes a fairly comprehensive package of objectives that get to, I think, most of the key things that we're going to want to capture when we start to evaluate these projects.
Supervisor Alcorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I think the safety objective there, I think that kind of underscores why safety needs to be its own goal. Because I don't think it really belongs under resiliency, in my opinion. And frankly, I realize it's hard to project measurements for safety, but I think we need to start in terms of actually having safety be part of the planning process for new transportation projects. You know, the likely number of deaths from, you know, a road at a given speed. You know, those are, I think, you know, we're looking at Vision Zero type objectives for pedestrians and bicyclists, and I think it probably is time for us to put safety up as a goal.
Thank you.
And just to clarify, when we talk about safety, particularly under resiliency, are we talking about transportation safety, or are we talking about, for instance, if there were terrorist attack or something of that matter?
So
Or both?
typically those get separated as safety and security. And typically when we've talked about this before, we've talked about it purely from the safety perspective. I'll be honest, I don't know if that's still the way we want to go. If we want to talk about personal security as part of that. And the other thing that may or may not be really applicable this year that never has been before is the public health aspect of safety that we may want to consider as well, which we've never really thought to do before.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I would agree with that because I think safety is very important when you're talking about you're asking people to walk to the metro. And so you want them to feel secure that, you know, that they're able to use our transportation system without, you know, fear of, you know, anything, you know, tax or whatever.
Yeah, there's a lot of aspects to it. I mean, you think about just even a bus stop, does it have a light at it? Do that kind of safety or security, or you were saying with COVID, I mean, you're jamming a lot of people on a bus, is that safe, or I don't know. No, I don't know, but I understand what you're saying about measuring too.
And that's why I was getting in, like, what can the model measure versus,
Right.
you know, what's the goal? Because we need to be able to show some output, if you will, versus what we would like to see as some goals. I remember when we had the conversation about safety on the current transaction plan, you know, the authority members were split, like, we shouldn't build anything if it isn't safe. You know, why are we looking at safety independently? Because everything should be safe. Versus, well, do we look at safety as its own goal? And I think where we landed, we did have safety as its own goal, but inherently, anything that we invest in or include should be safe. Now, getting to the safety security aspect is a little more interesting, because I would ask Dahlia, how do we account for that for a modeling or an analysis purposes?
Yeah, and I will admit that I do not have an answer in my pocket for that one. But I think it would have to be both a combination of, say, identifying how many people might be using a facility or nearby a certain kind of facility, and then some amount of qualitative judgment that is saying this is going to improve security for this many people or that sort of thing. We can do some more thinking about it, but off the top of my head, that's it.
We also have that conversation when it comes to some of the technology components. I know Mayor Rishel is always like cybersecurity. So, and you know, we as the authority, you know, we can't assess cybersecurity, but it's something we need to be very cognizant of when we're talking about implementing some of these technologies.
Yeah, so if we're talking about connecting automated vehicles per se, and that's something we want to get to, the cybersecurity piece of it or other pieces of it might be important elements in order to get to the other thing that we're trying to do.
And let me just jump to that, automated vehicles and safety. That's an example where we're going to need to start measuring the deployment of automated vehicles because they will save lives.
Oh, yeah.
And so, so again, I would make a pitch. Another reason why safety might be because the measurements might not be currently done, but
Now, 24.
So we definitely are including the opportunity to look at automated vehicles in 2045 and what those impacts might be. And you guys are doing all of my segues. The scenarios next, unless anybody has anything else they want to talk about. I'm going to bring you on all of my presentations for you guys. Okay, so we will define goals, objectives, performance metrics, and weights to go with these. And we will be doing the analysis primarily on these sort of COGS standard forecasts that Monica talked about earlier. But what we also want to take a look at, as Keith mentioned, is what else might happen in the region. So that these COG forecasts are built off of, you know, what was expected maybe last year to happen in the region from a land use perspective, but the model itself is built off the assumption that travel patterns are going to continue to be what they have been over the last 20 years. And I think, yeah, that's the face. So every single one of us can say that doesn't seem super likely, does it? And we can all imagine very clearly reasons that that might be the case in the medium term and potentially in the long term. So what we want to make sure that we're looking at here is potential future scenarios to understand what the impacts might be. And as we like to say, avoiding investment obsolescence, right? We want to make sure that the things we're investing in are still going to be good investments if. And so we're not really looking here at predicting a most likely future. We're not really looking at picking our preferred future. We want to understand how some of these things might change if they happen, if some combination of them happens. And so all of that is really very assumptions based. So we're guessing. We're planning to do 4 scenarios. I could do 140 of them for you. I've been wrong every time, but it gives us some guidance. It gives us some direction on what could happen, so that as the region continues to plan, you can continue to keep an eye on these things and continue to improve. So we are looking at 4 potential scenarios. These are the ones we're thinking of at the moment. So the first one really speaks to technology, speaks to the automated, shared, connected electric vehicles. So what might by 2045 that look like if we really have those widely deployed on the region's roads, in our transit systems? What might that do across all of these objectives and measures that we just talked about? We see dramatic increases in transit usage. We see dramatic decreases in emissions if we've got that electric piece going. So really understanding what the difference is there and sort of identifying if that was a feature we were trying to get to. Are there other things we maybe need to think about, either from a policy perspective or an investment perspective, right? Is that electric charging infrastructure or something? That's one scenario. The second one that we're looking at is transportation pricing and incentive scenario. So thinking about, are there transportation resources, whether that's congestion pricing, whether that's VMT pricing or curb pricing? You know, we haven't sorted that bit quite out yet. Are there pricing strategies that can be used to encourage people to use other modes? And sort of the flip side of that, are there incentive strategies that can be used to encourage the use of those other So it might be, we've, in our other communities, talked a couple of times about making transit free as an incentive. But there are other sort of strategies, almost game theory type things that are being discussed in the industry. And so this will give us an opportunity to think about what a version of that might look like and what kind of impact that might have. The third scenario we're thinking about right now would be focused on significant climate change. Might be and how the potential sea level rise or something else could really impact the network and how it performs, and that's across most as well. And then it's 2021, so we have to do a post-pandemic new normal scenario that considers, all right, what if we all do continue to work from home, whether it's full-time or 3 days a week, whatever that might be, that e-commerce continues to grow at the rate it has been, all of those things to understand, well, if that really does cut down on whether it's total demand for transit, peak periods, what does that really do so that we can start to think about, okay, well, we may need to reconsider some investment priorities if that looks like it's going to be a long-term trend. So those are the four we're thinking about right now. Thoughts, concerns?
Madam Chair, Vice Mayor Martinez from Town of Leesburg, some questions and comments. Can I read them off of the chat box?
Is there now?
So that's,
I
Vice Mayor
can go ahead
Martinez.
and do that if you'd like.
Oh, would like to speak.
It's not clear, so I can just read the question off of the chat box.
And
It's questioning on the chat box
Yes,
as well.
please do, please do.
So the first one is, did we cover the potential change in business best practices due to the change of work at home has had on the transportation?
So that would be something that would be covered by that fourth scenario we just discussed. It would not be incorporated into the baseline model, which would still be based off of those cooperative forecasts that we talked about. But we would definitely want to take a look as part of that fourth scenario.
Second question is, have we considered the impact of e-scooters, electric scooters, and micro-mobility devices on the overall transportation system?
Yeah, I have a tendency to call pedestrian and bikes non-motorized, but that's not entirely true anymore. So yes, we do want to make sure we're including what I believe the industry term right now is micro-mobility. And that would include the shared scooters, the shared bikes, the shared pogo sticks, if that's what comes next, into those measures as well.
And the last question is, are we making an assumption that the current changes are short-term?
Say that one more time.
Are the current changes in travel patterns, are they short-term?
So yes, in the baseline model, we are assuming that by 2045, which is 24 years from now, that we will have gone back to somewhat normal. We know that may or may not be true, and none of us have any way to know that at the moment. So that is why we want to make sure we're doing that pandemic new normal scenario. I think that'll be really important. And I will say that, as Keith mentioned, we're not planning to run these scenarios until phase 2, so until next year, which means we'll have a little bit more time to see what is starting to happen in the new normal before we have to make decisions on what we think the scenario might look like.
Okay, and if I might add one other thing. During the majority of this meeting, there were two conversations going on, and I had a hard time trying to separate them from one to the other. I don't know if it's because of the sidebar conversations that were being picked up by the computer or not, but I would really appreciate that if we do this again, that we look into limiting sidebar conversations because of the mic pickup.
Okay, thank you. We did not have sidebar conversations, so I don't know if it was just a tech problem, and I think it was. I apologize, you didn't hear that. Was there anything specific that you wanted us to repeat?
No, I think I caught the gist of it all, and I also have been following with the presentation, so I didn't miss a lot. I just missed some of the conversations you guys are having, but I think we were catching up, so I'm okay. You answered my primary questions anyway.
Okay, thank you. And Supervisor Awkward.
So on the second bullet under purpose of scenario analysis, I think it would be very helpful. We do want to make sure that a range is tested. And so, for example, and I think it's embedded in there, but, at some point we're testing a scenario about concentrated growth. We also would need to test a more dispersed growth market.
So I will say that this time around, we're not planning on testing land use changes. We did do that in the last transaction. But for right now, unless we want to incorporate land use changes that might be spurred by some of these. So the argument could certainly be made that in a post-pandemic new normal, nobody needs to live near DC anymore. So everybody moves out into Loudoun and Prince William or West Virginia. That argument could be made, so we could incorporate it that way, but we are not at this point planning to test solely land use based.
Why not?
Part of it, I think, has to do with, we did this last time, and it's been done a lot at a regional level through different projects. But a lot of the jurisdictional staff last time, if I'm remembering correctly, felt like they had done a lot of work to get their land use plans where they want them to be. And they didn't necessarily want someone to come in and tell them, oh, you should make that different than you've already planned. I think that was some of the reaction we got last time. If I remember.
Madam Chair,
Yeah,
can I respond to that? A little bit more detail. As Darlene mentioned, we did it last time around, and I think we can provide a synopsis of what we found. Unless we dramatically change the assumptions from last time, I don't think we'd find anything different. I mean, it would broadly be the same. And what we did last time was is to look at the growth that was expected to happen between the base and the horizon year, which was 8%. Whatever the growth was the growth, and that was redistributed away from the planning forecasts that have been agreed in the region to actually what Monica, I think, was called, maybe it was you, called bookends. So we went to one extreme, which was to look at that growth and put it all on the regional activity centres as designated by COG. And then the other bookend was to disperse it everywhere else. And to be honest, I think it didn't change a whole lot. And the reason is because although there's growth, I mean, the jobs we're talking about
37%.
and for population is 24%. They were the growth numbers we were looking at. But really the number of places where you could distribute that is such that it doesn't actually make a big difference. And as Darlene said, there was the concern, well, why would you test something you never want to do? Well, and that actually was not the point of the scenarios, because 3 of the 4 of those scenarios, with the exception being transportation pricing and incentives, are basically responding to things that MBTA and probably you guys as well have no control over. These things could happen and we have to react. And so the process of scenario analysis was to evaluate what we might be dealing with if something else happened we couldn't control. And that was, with land use, it was felt that really wasn't so out of control. So, it wasn't a likely thing that was going to happen anyway. And as I said earlier, unless we dramatically change the assumptions, we'd expect the same outcome.
I actually think that'd be a brilliant answer.
No, that's a very good answer, and I understand. I mean, we're not starting from a blank sheet.
Yeah.
We have infrastructure, we have buildings,
Right.
all over. The only caution I would encourage you to think about this, maybe it comes under the post-pandemic new normal, would be changes in land usage of buildings that is not expected. So what if, for example, if our office market shrinks by a third, over the next 20 years, and our residential market grows twice as fast as we think it might. That could change.
Yeah. And I think there's probably room for some of these to incorporate land use pieces.
Yeah.
But they're not going to be entirely based just around it. But I think that the thought of bringing back the findings from the last transaction over the dense versus sparse versus the opposite dense, land use scenarios, just to reiterate those findings, which would, as was mentioned, likely be the same to sort of complement this, I think would be useful.
All right, no, thank you. That's very helpful. But again, under the pandemic new normal, I would expand that to include some of these things.
I think that's great.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that when I saw the post-pandemic new normal a couple of months ago, our board had CEO of Multimodal to speak to us about that, and he was saying that we have to look at it at a new normal because we don't have the rush hour like we used to. There's no, the morning and evening rush hour group of people that are coming in, and then that it's more, what was the word? Gosh, I just had it, like more experience of going to different places, events that people are using, our transit system. So I think that we have to really take that into consideration also.
Absolutely. Yeah, we want to incorporate that into that scenario as well. Okay. All right, so that is all the, depending on your perspective, exciting or boring technical stuff that I have for tonight. So I think just sort of next steps, which were already covered at the beginning, but we are working with the couple to try and get some of their input on it. We're going to incorporate everything we heard tonight and with the other committees from jurisdictional staff and from the public to try and both update the goals and objectives, but also to start to draft out what we think might be those metrics that go with them. So we'll be back with updated information and stuff for you at your September meeting. And we can talk about all of this one more time.
Hey, thank you so much. It was a great presentation and such good, everybody.
And thank you all for doing parts of it for me.
Led you along. Great. Okay. And anyone remotely, did anyone have a question who is zooming in? You all are good? Okay. Excellent. Okay. That means we can go to Ms. Bachman, Chair NDTA.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be brief, just to remind everyone that the authority issued a call for projects for the fiscal year 2022 to 2027 6-year program. The call started July 1, or it opened July 1. It closes October 1st at 5 p.m. Does the system shut down at 5:01 p.m.?
Absolutely.
Okay, so again, October 1 at 5 p.m. You do get an additional 2 months to get the resolution of support from the local governing bodies, because we understand it may take a while to go through the process, clerks and all of that to get the resolutions, but the applications are due October 1. I've been asked this question often: how much will we have to populate the program? Now, I will know, even though we say FY 2022 to 2027, the new years are really fiscal years 26 and 27. The other years we've already put funding on. I don't know just yet how much we will have to populate that program. We will be working with the finance committee, looking at some of the revenues that have come in and what is projected and estimated to come in. And then the finance committee will make a recommendation to the authority on the estimated available amount of revenues for the 6-year program, because it is out years that we're looking at. One other thing that I would like to add, we have done for the 6-year program we adopted last year, and for our novel 6-year programs, forward appropriations. And what that means is if you have a project that's adopted as part of the 6-year program that we're currently doing, can you use monies sooner than fiscal years 26 and 27? At this time, and I'm saying this now because I've been asked about this as well, will we be in a position to accommodate any forward appropriation requests? I don't know. Hopefully, Hopefully, for the 6-year program we adopted last July, we were in a position to honor the forward appropriation request. But again, that's something that the picture will become a little more clearer, actually, once we adopt the funding program to see where the projects are and the requested allocation.
Any requirements or anything you wanna focus on or let us know to take back to our jurisdiction?
Coordinate. Well, number one, of course, the projects must be in transaction. That is the law. The projects must be in transaction, the current transaction. The application does ask for a transaction ID number. By my staff, we do go in and check because we want to make sure that we're adhering to the law, but make sure that the projects meet the core values, if you will. And just especially because these are regional projects, and oftentimes you can have a project in jurisdiction A that greatly impacts jurisdiction B. We encourage those level of conversations and support happening. And then ideally, if both localities would submit a resolution of support, that would be great. Because we do want to make sure that it's a high level of support from the multiple localities and or agencies.
Any questions? Hoffman?
One more thing, Central. If it's a continuation project, now a continuation project is a project that we have funded previously, whatever phase, and you're asking for more money, project should be advancing. Okay, now that was it.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, good. So we're gonna get a survey that you want us to share. And our next meeting is September 22nd. We're not having an August meeting. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Motion to adjourn.
Good summer, everybody. Rest of it. Take care.
Bye.
Good evening.
Everybody.